20 minutes before 7. Thanks so much for tuning in to Morning Live. Now, as we've been reporting in our lead story in the news this morning, South Africa has announced a stimulus package of 500 billion rand to mitigate the impact of COVID-19. The money, which is equivalent to 10% of the country's GDP, will be raised from resources redirected from the current budget and also through borrowing from local and international funders. So for some reaction, we're joined via Skype now by development economist Ndumiso Hadebe. Thanks so much for speaking to us this morning and welcome to Morning Live.
Thanks so much for having me, Sakina, and good morning to the viewers.
Ndumiso, first off, your overall reaction to the stimulus package announced by the President.
Well, I think this particular stimulus package comes within the context where the spread of the coronavirus has been gradually increasing, although we have had quite a unique case compared to other countries across the globe. And again, South Africa is entering winter. And so the probabilities of increased transmissions is quite likely. And I think it is within this context that this particular economic and social recovery plan was crafted to balance out the economic impediments that this pandemic will have to the South African economy, but also to really balance it out with some of the social issues, as we've seen in terms of how the grant transfers directed at individuals have been structured. We've seen that over the next 3 to 6 months, there have been additional increases to social grants to children and to even individuals who are unemployed presently and are not receiving any sort of income to support them in this instance. I think such interventions become quite important because given the South African socio-economic positioning, we'd often find that the increase in unemployment, which will be recorded as a result of this virus, tends to result in higher incidences of crime, of higher incidences of murder cases. And so this particular intervention, I believe, was crafted in such a manner that would be able to address both the economic and social issues that South Africa currently faces. We've also seen the kind of interventions that have been aimed to directly target South African small business enterprises, when we've seen loan guarantees together with South African banks and National Treasury to get money into the pockets of small businesses and in the pockets of workers as well, given the period that we're in.
So one of the questions that many are grappling with is where exactly is that money going to come from? And also you're looking at 10% of GDP, and what sort of impact do you foresee in Ndumiso this having post-COVID-19?
A post-COVID-19 economy, Sakina, unfortunately will lead to increased levels of public debt. And as a consequence of that, it will mean that our fiscal position will also be severely constrained, particularly because the funding will be sourced from or redirected from current adjustments in our current expenditure framework, but also depending on what kind of domestic and international debt that we acquire, that will significantly impact South Africa's debt positioning. But I think it's also quite important to also note that South Africa's fiscal framework is such that when we look at sourcing international debt, of that international debt, it only comprises 10% of our budget in South Africa. So I think based on the debt that we accumulate, 90% of that is rand-denominated debt. And so as a result, it mitigates the currency risks that are associated with sourcing international denominated debt. But certainly a post-COVID-19 economy will result in very sluggish levels of growth. It will result in a much more severe public debt situation. But I think given this war-type-like scenario that South Africa and the globe finds itself, the responses need to be equal to manage the current pandemic. But more importantly than that, it's also quite important that these interventions are seen in the light of a post-COVID-19 economy that deals with the structural blockages that South Africa has been facing. And we know that in South Africa over the past couple of years, we've had over 1 trillion rands available in liquidity from the private sector. And I think all the more important, a post-COVID-19 economy would have to solicit ways in which we can leverage such liquidity in the economy.
Okay, Ndumiso, let's speak in layman's terms now, in terms of where exactly is that money? Do we have that money available right now? The President spoke of 130 billion rand that was to be reprioritized from funds that government currently has budgeted for. So what sort of reprioritization are we looking at?
So South Africa's budget, for instance, every year South Africa has a contingency reserve allocation in its budget. In the past couple of years, it's been around 8 billion rand, give or take. And so that would be the first sourcing of this particular funding with respect to these economic interventions. Secondly, would be reprioritization from departments that have not utilized or are not utilizing their allocations with respect to spending in other areas. That's the second source of where this funding can possibly come from. Thirdly, would be domestic debt, as we've highlighted earlier, with respect to where can we get, whether it be from domestic lenders and even from institutions such as the New Development Bank, given the contributions that South Africa makes to that bank, that is another available source of being able to get this funding. And then lastly, being some of the talks that the Minister of Finance had highlighted with respect to the World Bank or the IMF, soliciting healthcare-specific debt to be able to address South Africa's economic responses and healthcare responses to this pandemic and being able to source additional supplies. So really, those are the four type of revenue or income sources that South Africa can be able to leverage to finance this particular economic and social intervention.
So let's just for a moment look at the Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF and the World Bank. And they already have received the thumbs down from the Tripartite Alliance through its secretariat. So where does that leave Finance Minister Tito Mboweni in terms of raising funds from that avenue?
Politically, that is quite a difficult position because we would know that the track record of the International Monetary Fund, not only in South Africa but across all developing nations, the effect of the type of aid and the conditions that it comes with has not necessarily resulted in the prosperity or the growth from an employment perspective that has been envisaged, but more particularly from a development perspective. And so from a tripartite alliance perspective, it's quite a very difficult decision for the Minister of Finance to make. And for him to be able to take that decision, I think from a political perspective, it will not be a pleasant undertaking if that would be taken. But I think over and above that, the important issue, and I think the Minister of Finance has been quite specific to elucidate that if they were to solicit financing from Bretton Woods institutions, being the IMF or the World Bank or any other of its agencies, it would be specifically for healthcare costs. I don't know whether that means that it would be a laxing of the type of conditioning or conditions that comes with financing from Bretton Woods institutions or not. But politically, I think it would definitely not be an easily acceptable proposal or an undertaking in this instance.
So we talk about, of course, what needs to be done on the medical front, but then there's also the municipalities and the role that they have to play. And the President mentioned there the emergency water, sanitation of public transport, as well as food and shelter for the homeless. And we know that our municipalities are, by and large, either under administration or they're dysfunctional. So how's this supposed to play out?
Our local government, or the sphere of local government, has continued to has continued to present a number of challenges in South Africa. Not only from the reports that we've seen from the Auditor General, even with this allocation, one of the biggest issues is the administration of this economic and social relief, and whether or not it will reach the intended recipients. I've seen as well with respect to some of the stockpiles of food parcels and the gross misallocation of the resources for the poor in this instance, not necessarily being what has been the government's bank for their buck. And so that continues to be quite an area of concern. And for me personally, I do anticipate there will be fiscal leakages in that instance. I think as well this instance or this pandemic in South Africa really necessitates or sharpens the point of having a capable developmental state. And what that means, therefore, it means that local government needs to work efficiently and effectively, particularly in communities where access to public facilities or access to employment opportunities is disproportionately affected towards those communities. And as such, I would think that this particular intervention should not be monetary in instance, but it also should be a combination of building capacity at the level of local government to ensure that even this relief, 500 billion rands in forms of different reliefs, as it were, does indeed reach the intended participants. But I think in its current shape or form of local government, there are bound to be fiscal leakages in terms of the interventions that have been stipulated by the president.
So, Ndumiso, many people would say it's all good and well. We can talk about this 500 billion rand relief package, but as you also point out, it all comes to naught if it doesn't reach the intended recipients. So, given what we are faced with currently since the lockdown began, we've seen SASSA struggle to distribute those food parcels, people struggling to get in touch so that they could actually access those food parcels effectively. We've seen the UIF struggle. People can't get through to them. They are struggling, the UIF, at the best of times with their core mandate. And now this is an additional bit of work that they need to do. Again, how do people draw any level of comfort, any level of, hope that this is actually going to work for them in the time that they need it?
Well, one of the things that have been fascinating about South Africa, even in the midst of the challenges that it continues to face and the challenges that it has faced and some, in certain instances, has overcome in the past, is that South African citizens are quite resilient. They're quite resilient in the sense that they've been able to withstand a situation where we've had over 30% levels of unemployment and chronic inequality in the South African economy. And with respect to the situation of the South African security services, we've seen the type of lines and queues when there are withdrawals of grants and of pensions funds by beneficiaries in this instance. That continues to be a problem that stifles the efficiency of grant recipients. It continues to even expose grant recipients to the transmission of the COVID-19 pandemic, given the long queues. The president had cited in his statement last night that there will be a technological intervention that will aid the more efficient transfer of these grants to its intended beneficiaries. I would be interested to understand what that technological intervention looks like, but as well, given the information, communication and technology gap that exists between urban populations and their rural counterparts, it presents a number of challenges around how that access and that distribution will take place. But I do trust that in South Africa, we do have certain public officials that are willing to serve and to ensure that over this time we're able to galvanize all the resources that we have to be able to ensure that the intended participants receive these social grants. But indeed, there are structural challenges that South African government and state agencies continue to face, particularly in the redistribution of social grants.
Good intentions is one thing. As we've continued to say throughout the morning in Ndumiso, it's all about the implementation, because people are literally going hungry at this stage. So you have SASSA taking care of a database of people that's already there, and that should be straightforward enough for the relief that was announced for that cohort. But when you look at the unemployed people that the president mentioned, 350 rand to all those who are unemployed. Who is unemployed? How would you go about defining that? How do you draw up a database for that? And how do you distribute those funds timeously?
Yeah, I think I should applaud the president, number one, for identifying folks that are unemployed and them to be able to receive that social grant. I think that's quite important, because for me, when I heard the president stipulate that, it speaks to the type of individuals that are socially vulnerable. So, for instance, we could have a situation where someone who is, if we were to draw a marginal instance in terms of the exposure to vulnerability, someone who may have had a temporary job as a garden worker or as an artisan, an informal worker, who no longer has that access of income over this period, their levels of or severity of vulnerability towards the exposure to poverty is much more heightened than, for instance, somebody who does indeed receive a social grant every single month. So there's that variation that's quite important in understanding the social vulnerability of different profiles of South Africans. In terms of targeting this particular profile to individuals who are indeed unemployed and who should be the intended participants, it becomes an exercise where I think even the president has stipulated there would be a criterion that is used. But again, in the South African case, the administration of such an intervention continues to be quite a difficult one. But I think here we have a very resilient and robust private sector, and it's quite important that in such instances that government does cooperate in partnership with the private sector, who have the requisite platforms, access to communities to be able to make these transfers possible to the intended participants, and that the vetting of individuals who ought to be beneficiaries of this is done in an equitable manner as opposed to a fair manner. Equity speaking to this question of the extent of social vulnerability from an exposure to a lack of income.
But these are unusual times in Ndumiso, and what we've seen is that people who would usually be in a position to take care of themselves suddenly find themselves distressed at this point. So if you take, for example, the SA Express employees who, without any warning, were simply not paid their salaries. Now, here is someone who ordinarily would be able to take care of themselves, who suddenly find themselves without means. How then do you define who is unemployed, who is in need of this relief at this stage? Because as you pointed out, we're looking at about just over 29% unemployment by the official rate. And then there's the expanded definition and, of course, the hardship brought about by this COVID-19. So when is all of this going to be, thought out and finalized?
So one of the easiest ways that that can be done to really ensure that these grants reach the intended participants, and I think it's worth acknowledging that the social grants itself, or the 350 rands, as it were, is really measly and will not necessarily address the significant impact that they would have had if these are individuals who have been impacted by retrenchments or deferral of payments, or who have been affected by a no work, no pay principle based on the type of sector that they're working in. In addition to that, we've seen that in this pronouncement, the president has identified workers such as athletes, artists, and other technical assistants who work seasonable jobs. This would be quite important. It would be quite key to understand how we would be able to target specific industries. Two, which industries have been significantly affected by this particular pandemic. Three, what kind of registry from the Department of Labor is available for such workers based on the compliance of whether it be from a tax registration number, if these are individuals who may have been registered for tax or who have been working for small businesses, employers of those small businesses registering workers who may have had a loss of income, or young people who might particularly fall within the NEET rate, which is not in employment, education or training, NEET, in using that particular registry in soliciting which, based on the social vulnerability of these individuals, how can then these transfers of grants directly be reached to those participants. That is a very technical exercise that not government alone cannot be able to fulfill that exercise. It does require some very technical support and assistance from the private sector to ensure that it does indeed take place.
Well, Ndumiso Hadebe, thanks for your time this morning. Development economist giving us his views and reaction to that stimulus package announced by President Cyril Ramaphosa last night. And we're also taking your reaction in our question of the day to this. We're going to take a break now, and on the